Greetings everyone and welcome back to 365 Days of Prog. Today we're gonna be reviewing Au-Delà du Délire by Ange.
Hi, my name's Naomi. I'm an avid progressive rock fan, but I'm a long ways from knowing all the prog albums out there. But this year, I'm gonna give it a try. This is 365 Days of Prog.
Now, pardon my French as I'm gonna obliterate all the names of the songs in this album, but this is the first French album we're actually encountering on this list, and I'm very much excited for it. But without further ado, here are some of my favorite bits from this album. So, as I said, this is Au-Delà du Délire by the French band Ange, and they are probably the quintessential French progressive rock band. They've been around from the early 70s and they've been creating music since then until this very day. Now, the name Au-Delà du Délire is translated to Beyond Delirium, and this album in particular is probably considered as their masterpiece, being the quintessential progressive rock French album, and with a measly 37 minutes of runtime, that is indeed quite the title. Now, although this band and this album in particular are considered as symphonic prog, I would say that this album could be categorized as just something different, because it doesn't really go to the pre-existent conceptual ideas of Western progressive music, and it goes in different directions which are unheard of outside of France. So a few days ago we listened to the Point du Film by Magma, the Brazilian band, and they did have a very unique progressive take, but it isn't even as close to the alienated feeling that I got from listening to this album in particular, because it has some really interesting inspirations and traditional influences put into it that make it all the more special. So to me, at least with my limited knowledge, it felt like there's a lot of influence from French theater, and mostly what I know is Comédie dell'arte, and thinking a lot about Molière and his works, it really does feel like this is a play being shown, and overall having a tone of storytelling slash singing that sounds a lot like how Peter Gabriel does with early Genesis. And all of these different elements, which are really unlike anything I've heard in the West, sound very far from what we know in the UK and the US, and it actually kinda is mind-boggling to think that this was also made in Europe. Now, I will say about this album in particular that it has been a very definitive learning experience. It is far from being a perfect album in my opinion, but I've learned a lot from it and I definitely listened to something new. It has been a long time since listening to something which is truly original and unique and nothing like I've ever heard before. Now, when starting to listen to this album, the reality of it kinda dawned on me and I realized that I have to open up a translated version of the lyrics. So what I did, I looked up each song and I actually translated them myself through Google Translate, and I read the lyrics as the songs went along, because this album in particular is very reliant on the lyrics, sometimes even more reliant on them than the melody itself. And that might have been a pretty acceptable notion if the lyrics themselves were carrying this album, but I don't think that's the case. The lyrics are nice, but at most points they're pretty confusing and they don't really provide the extra, oomph that this album really needs to survive. There's just something about the lyrics themselves that really feel disconnected with everything that's going on. It feels like there's some sort of excerpts out of French plays. They're very metaphorical, they're very, poetic in some way, but they don't really have a lot of context in the entire meaning of the album. Now, I've read that French speakers would enjoy the humor laid down in this album, but honestly, from my casual reading of the lyrics, I couldn't really find anything that was all the more humorous, but there is something else that I kinda liked about it. As much as I like criticizing the lyrics for this album, there is one song in particular that kind of resonated with me, and that's the song, and I'm gonna butcher the name because it's in French, but it's Si je la Messie, which is translated to If I Were the Messiah. And that track in particular focuses on the absurdness of following figures in religion sometimes, and I like the way that it presented its own idea with having a recurring motive and recurring lines, and I think that's kind of cool. And personally, I have a favorite quote from that song. Si je le Messie, je reconnais n'importe. I'm just joking with you, of course I'm not gonna read it in French. No, the quote itself actually goes something like this. If I were the Messiah, I would walk on water. Anywhere, anyhow, and people would drown, always believing to do well. I'm not gonna get into religion in this one, but I will say that I kinda like the way that it presented things in this song in particular. Another thing which I really liked about this album is its usage of characters. There are a multitude of characters speaking on this album, and they're all supposed to be part of a story or one play, and I think that's really nice, and that really hinders to that, as I said, Peter Gabriel Genesis. So you've got songs like Goodvin the Villain or The Sugar Battle, or even the title track of Beyond Delirium, all using that specific concept in a way that's really interesting, although to me as a non-French native speaker it was kinda hard to follow which character was saying what. But I think the thing that really bothered me about the lyrics in this album mostly is the fact that whenever there was singing or storytelling going along, the music itself wasn't really evolving or progressing, and you can really see that a lot in the songs where they do the singing part and then it comes halfway and the vocals are over, and only then does the band spring into life and start playing actual music, interesting music, progressive music, and that's kind of a bummer because honestly my favorite bits from this album were mostly the music parts and not the singing parts. And that also reflects in my favorite track from this album. I chose the one which to me at least felt like the one that was mostly instrumentally driven, not driven by its lyrics, and that has to be the track called Ballade pour Ange, and that one translates to Ballad for an Orgy. Very mature of me. But one thing that really amazes me about this album is not the album itself, but the reception people give it. A lot of people say that this really sounds like Yes and a lot like King Crimson, and I honestly don't really get that. They say that it has this grandiose sound that only King Crimson did back in their early days, and really I don't see that at all. At least to me this seems like an odd breed that really isn't all that amazing when it comes to the music and is heavily reliant on the lyrics themselves. There seems to be an ability for the band to actually play great music, but they don't seem to utilize it most of the time, and that's quite of a bummer. And this album does really explore a lot of new and interesting ideas melodically, so I guess I wouldn't say that this even comes close to anything that I know from Yes or King Crimson. But yeah, overall this album isn't entirely bad. I just think that without having the lyrics open in front of you or without knowing French, there's really a lot to miss in this album, and I don't really get the appeal that it has in the West. But I would say that I had quite a bit of fun listening to it, and I kind of enjoyed the aesthetics of the theater and play put into it, but honestly it didn't really amaze me. So when it comes to French progressive rock, I am still waiting for something to, you know, blow me away because it hasn't come so far. I don't know how many more French bands we have on here, but I do believe that there are a bit more, so hopefully something like this but better will come in the future. So this cover somehow became synonymous with being a cover of a great album to me. That is because I only saw this cover, you know, a teeny tiny amount of times in obscure prog websites, people saying that it's great and it's, you know, really good and this album is something you should listen to, and thus I got this conception that this album was in particular a hidden gem of prog. Now I have discovered that this album isn't all much grandiose as I thought it might have been, but still I had a good time listening to it, and the cover itself still kind of evokes some feelings of grandiose and amazingness in it. Now when it comes to the imagery of this cover, I think it's pretty lovely. I love the great color palette put on here. It's brighter, it's more vibrant than most things we see, and I like that quite a lot. I like the imagery, I like the fact that there's this person which doesn't have really the soles of his boots, which is, you know, odd, and he's treading this path towards a faraway, very magical castle. I have no idea what any of this means. tunes. I don't know if it really connects to the story itself because, as I said, it was kind of hard to follow along with the lyrics, but I don't know, it's a pretty neat cover. It's very surrealistic in some way and very metaphorical as it seems, and I like it quite a lot. And it also kind of feels to me like PFM covers, the Italian band. It has this sort of same aesthetic of being recognizable but not quite understandable. But when it comes to the rating of this album, this one gets a pretty acceptable 7 out of 10. It's good, it's unique, it's not that memorable in the way that I like memorability to be, and I guess that only is acceptable because I've listened to it only once. But that's about it, guys. I hope that you enjoyed this video and stay tuned for tomorrow because we're going to be listening to Inoculous Mice by Trumhouse. As well, I want to thank my lovely supporters on Patreon, so thank you so much to Brian and Clay Walnum, you guys are the best, and if any of you want to support me over on Patreon, you can find the links down in the description or in my About page. But that's about it, guys. Have a wonderful day and I'll catch you all tomorrow. Bye, guys.